It's July 1981. You can almost hear the sound of church bells ringing, crowds cheering, and cameras clicking like a relentless drumbeat. Diana Spencer, just 20 years old, walks down the aisle of St. Paul's Cathedral in a cloud of ivory silk and antique lace. Her smile is soft, almost unsure, and her hands tremble ever so slightly beneath the massive sleeves of her gown. You can almost feel the weight of the fabric dragging behind her, a 25-foot train meant to symbolize fairy tale perfection. But behind the glitz and spectacle, there feels heavy, and if you listen closely enough, you can hear the whispers swirling beneath the pageantry, doubts, secrets, and a dark undercurrent of sadness. And hey, tell me your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where you're all tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The story begins not with love at first sight, but with duty, lineage, and a ticking clock. Charles, Prince of Wales, was 32 when he proposed to Diana. That's right, 12 years her senior. It wasn't exactly a rom-com meet cute. Historians still argue whether Charles even loved her at all or if he just felt pressured by the crown's invisible stopwatch. He dated Diana's older sister, Sarah, before. How's that for a family dinner awkward moment? When Charles did pop the question in February 1981, Diana reportedly laughed, thinking he was joking. A royal proposal from a man she barely knew. Surely that wasn't how the story was supposed to go. But within hours, she was whisked into a whirlwind of interviews, fittings, and rehearsals, preparing for a wedding that would make headlines across the globe. And Charles, well, even as he placed the famous sapphire ring on Diana's finger, he couldn't resist a sly nod to the past. He and Camilla Parker Bowles had a long, complicated history, and that history wasn't going away. As one royal aide later whispered, there were 3 of us in that marriage, right from the start. Diana, for her part, seemed to glow in the public eye. The press nicknamed her Shy Day, and she was as wide-eyed as a lamb heading into the lion's den. She had no formal training, no blueprint for surviving palace life, just a charming smile, a winsome wave, and a head full of romantic dreams. The public adored her, and the media fed the frenzy front pages plastered with Diana's face, while Charles, the supposed hero of the fairy tale, faded into the background. But behind the closed doors of Buckingham Palace, things were far less magical. Diana later described her engagement as the worst time of my life. She reportedly threw herself down the stairs while pregnant with Prince William, hoping it would shake the numbness. A fact that historians still debate. Was it a cry for help, or something darker? The couple's first public engagement together was a tour of Wales, and Diana's star power was blinding. Crowds surged forward, desperate for a glimpse of the princess-to-be, while Charles looked on, seemingly unsure whether to be proud or envious. Even on that tour, some noted the early cracks, Diana struggling to learn Welsh phrases, Charles joking that she looked like a very fat Sloane Ranger in her formal coat. A charming comment, if you like your compliments, with a side of passive aggression. And yet, for all the pomp and circumstance, there was an undeniable sense that this story wasn't going to have the happily ever after everyone expected. Like watching a glitzy stage show where the curtains are stitched with warning signs, you can't help but feel the tension building. Diana was stepping into a world ruled by centuries of tradition, formality, and rigid expectations, while Charles was still pining for the one who got away. Let's be honest, if you were Diana, you'd probably feel a little queasy too. A fairy tale, yes, but one built on shaky foundations, with a castle that might crumble under the weight of duty and secrets. Diana may have been dubbed Shy Day by the press, but behind that sweet smile and soft voice was a young woman trying desperately to stay afloat. The cameras adored her. They caught every sparkle of her sapphire ring, every bashful glance beneath her fringe, and every awkward shuffle as she adjusted to life in the royal spotlight. The world watched, enchanted by her innocence and beauty. The tabloids couldn't get enough. It was as if the entire globe had fallen under Diana's spell, everyone except the one person who mattered most, Charles. Historians still argue whether Charles ever truly tried to connect with Diana. Was he too trapped in his own expectations, too weighed down by the crown, or simply too emotionally distant to notice the loneliness growing inside his new bride? Diana, for her part, tried to fit the role. She practiced her curtsies, learned how to greet foreign dignitaries, and even memorized the royal order of precedence. Imagine having to remember exactly when to curtsy to your own husband and when to nod to the queen. That's like playing a lifelong game of Simon Says, except the rules keep changing, and you can't win. But beneath the tiara and the well-rehearsed wave, Diana's confidence was fragile. The pressure of public life gnawed at her. She was barely out of her teens, thrust into a world of centuries-old traditions and stiff upper lips. When she walked into a room, every head turned, but inside, she often felt invisible. She later admitted to battling bulimia, binging, purging, a desperate attempt to control something, anything, and a life that felt like it wasn't hers anymore. Even the grand meals at the palace became a battleground, with Diana sneaking away to the bathroom, the sound of running water masking her tears. Then there was the matter of Charles. While Diana soaked up the world's adoration, Charles seemed to drift further away, like a man watching a movie he didn't quite understand. He'd grown up in the stiff formality of the royal household, where emotions were tidily packed away, and feelings were as welcome as a corgi at a state dinner. Diana, on the other hand, wore her heart on her sleeve, sometimes too openly for the monarchy's liking. One moment in particular captures the gulf between them. During a tour of Australia in 1983, Diana charmed the crowds like a pro, smiling, waving, crouching down to greet children. Charles, trailing behind her, once remarked, half-jokingly, "I'm the Prince of Wales, and I've been reduced to a mere escort for my wife." It was meant to be light-hearted, but the bitterness wasn't hard to miss. Still, Diana's glow only grew. Her choice of clothes, those bold colors and daring silhouettes, became fashion statements that women around the world copied. Remember the time she wore a black off-the-shoulder revenge dress to an event after Charles's infamous "whatever in love means" comment? That wasn't just a dress, it was a mic drop in satin, and the public adored her for it. Meanwhile, Charles seemed increasingly like a man out of step with the times, a relic of an old guard, while Diana sparkled like the future. The media fueled the divide, casting Diana as the radiant princess and Charles as the stiff, brooding prince. It wasn't entirely fair. Charles had his own burdens, his own insecurities. He was the heir to a throne that seemed both a blessing and a curse. His father, Prince Philip, had reportedly called him a romantic old fool, while the Queen, ever the stoic monarch, expected duty above all else. Historians still debate whether Charles was simply misunderstood or whether he really was, as some said, self-absorbed to see the damage unfolding. And all the while, in the shadows, Camilla lingered, an ever-present reminder that Diana's fairy tale wasn't the only story in town. The truth is, Diana may have won the world's heart, but she never truly won Charles's. That glow everyone saw, it was real, but it was also a shield. And behind it, Diana was already starting to dim. The thing about crowns is they don't just sparkle, they weigh you down. Diana soon learned this, not in a quiet, whispered moment, but in the harsh glare of flashbulbs and in blinking gaze of tradition. From the outside, she seemed to have everything: a prince, a palace, a future as queen. But inside, she was crumbling. The rules of royal life weren't written in any guidebook you could flip through over tea. They were unwritten and spoken, and yet as solid as the stone walls of Balmoral. And those rules, they didn't exactly leave space for a sensitive young woman trying to figure herself out. Diana's world narrowed into an endless cycle of appearances and expectations. Every step was choreographed, every word carefully chosen, every smile rehearsed. She had to know which fork to use at state banquets, how to hold her teacup at the perfect angle, when to speak, and more importantly, when to stay silent. One royal staff member once quipped that being a princess was a full-time performance art, except the critics were relentless, and there were no second takes. Meanwhile, Charles seemed to glide through it all, his emotional distance mistaken for royal composure, but even he couldn't escape the grinding pressure. The future king had to be a symbol, not a man. Historians still argue whether the monarchy's demands stripped Charles of any chance at a normal relationship. Was it the weight of the crown that broke him, or was he never built for love in the first place? Diana tried to play the role, but it was like dancing in shoes that pinched at every step. Her honeymoon, for instance, sounds romantic, right? Sun-drenched beaches, long walks by the sea, a future ahead of them. Except Charles brought along his watercolor paints and books by Lawrence van der Post, his favorite philosopher. Diana felt like a guest at her own wedding trip, watching as her husband disappeared into his own world. She later confided that she cried her eyes out on their honeymoon, feeling like a spare part rather than a cherished bride. There's a quirky detail often glossed over on their wedding cake. There was a sugar crown, but also tiny figurines of Charles and Diana. Except if you look closely, Charles's figure looks stiff, formal, almost disinterested, while Diana's is smiling brightly, almost too brightly, as if trying to convince herself it's all going to work out. A sugary metaphor for their marriage, if you ask me. And while Diana wrestled with her own demons, the palace machine kept churning. The Queen's staff, known as the Men in Grey, watched Diana with cautious eyes, taking notes, filing reports, managing the royal image like a corporation. Diana, young and emotional, didn't fit the mold. She wanted to talk openly about mental health, to break taboos around eating disorders and depression. But the palace didn't want messy. They wanted polished. It was like trying to hang a Picasso in a room full of stiff-backed chairs and doilies that just didn't belong. The pressure of motherhood added another layer. When Diana became pregnant with William, the world held its breath. The future king was on the way. But behind closed doors, Diana battled crippling morning sickness, and Charles reportedly complained about how moody she'd become. Yes, really. A man who once told friends he wished he could be reincarnated as Camilla's tampon, "I know you." And yes, that's a real quote. Didn't seem to grasp the depth of Diana's struggles. Diana was barely clinging on, but she kept showing up. At galas, at hospitals, at charity events, her smile like armor, her body growing thinner under the strain. The public loved her, but even that love became a burden. She was expected to be everything to everyone: the perfect mother, the elegant princess, the loving wife. But behind the palace gates, she was unraveling. And Charles, he just kept painting, kept reading, kept visiting Camilla for quiet chats and shared laughs. Diana's world was shrinking, while his seemed to stretch into private country lanes and cozy drawing rooms where Diana wasn't welcome. The question hung in the air like a stubborn fog. Could a marriage built on duty survive when love had long since left the building? Camilla, the name hung in there like an unwelcome guest at a family dinner. Everyone knew she was there, but no one wanted to talk about her. Diana knew. She'd known from the start, really. The woman who wore that signature pearl choker, who laughed with Charles in that soft, familiar way, who always seemed to be just a step behind the royal spotlight. Camilla Parker Bowles wasn't some vague friend of the family. She was the woman Charles had loved long before Diana entered the picture, and, as Diana was starting to realize, the woman he never quite stopped loving. Camilla had been married to Andrew Parker Bowles, a cavalry officer known for his charm and, let's just say, wandering eye. But the real story wasn't in Andrew's affairs, it was in Camilla's quiet, steady bond with Charles. They had dated in the early 70s, long before Diana came along, but Camilla wasn't considered suitable wife material for a future king. Historians still debate whether Charles truly wanted to marry Camilla in those early days, or if palace pressure and the ever-watchful Queen Mother nudged him in a different direction. Either way, Camilla remained in the background, a constant figure at parties, polo matches, and private weekends at Highgrove House. For Diana, it was like living in a house with a ghost you couldn't see but felt in every room. The phone calls, Charles stepping away to speak in hushed tones, smiling in that particular way. The gifts, bracelets inscribed with secret initials, like the infamous FNG for Fred and Gladys, their private nicknames. The quiet inside joke stopped the way Charles's face would light up when Camilla's name came up, even just in passing. Diana once found a package of cufflinks in Charles's belongings engraved with interlocking CS. That wasn't for Charles, it was for Camilla. And here's a quirky tidbit: Camilla's great-grandmother, Alice Keppel, had been the mistress of Charles's great-great-grandfather, King Edward VII. Royal side chicks apparently ran in the family. For Diana, the pain was a slow burn. She once confronted Camilla directly, telling her, "I know what's going on between you and Charles, and I just want you to know that." Camilla, cool as ever, reportedly replied, "You've got everything you ever wanted. All the men in the world fall in love with you, and you've got two beautiful children. What more do you want?" Diana's answer, "I want my husband." That exchange, raw and heartbreakingly human, laid bare the real tragedy. Diana didn't want to be a global icon or a fashion muse. She wanted to be loved. But in the royal family, love wasn't always the priority. Appearances were. And Charles, he kept Camilla close, even as the public clung to the fantasy of his perfect marriage. At parties, they'd stand side by side, talking in low voices, their body language casual but intimate to people who knew each other's stories by heart. Friends would say, "They're just old friends," but Diana knew better. She felt it in her bones, in the way Charles's attention would drift when Camilla was near, like a radio tuning to a familiar frequency. Historians still argue whether Charles ever truly tried to let Camilla go. Some say he did, briefly, after his wedding. Others believe he never stopped loving her, that she was the one constant in his life, the anchor in a sea of royal expectations. And maybe that's true, but for Diana, it was a slow, painful unraveling. The fairy tale she'd been sold was starting to look like a bad script, one where the leading lady never had a chance. It was a game she couldn't win. She was the princess, yes, but Camilla was the confidant, the familiar, the one who truly knew Charles. And that was a loneliness no amount of applause from adoring crowds could fix. July 29, 1981, the wedding of the century. The world tuned in, breathless, as Diana stepped out of the glass coach in her billowing ivory gown. That dress, with its puffed sleeves and 25-foot train, wasn't just fabric. It was a symbol, a statement. A fairy tale etched in taffeta, pearls, and antique lace. Designed by David and Elizabeth Emanuel, it was a frothy confection that seemed to swallow her whole. And yet, beneath the layers, Diana looked radiant. Or did she? The cameras didn't catch it, but Diana later admitted she barely slept the night before. She had discovered, in a quiet moment of heartbreak, a bracelet Charles had made for Camilla, yes, even the day before the wedding. A subtle, sparkling dagger to the heart. Yet, she stood there in the bright July sun, her veil fluttering, her smile pinned in place like a butterfly on display, while the world oohed and not. Historians still argue whether Diana's beaming face that day was real joy or a mask of pure, determined survival. The wedding was a global spectacle. 750 million people watched from their living rooms, and another 600,000 lined the streets of London, waving flags and cheering as the royal carriage passed. It was pageantry on a scale so grand it seemed unreal. The bells of St. Paul's rang out, choristers sang with angelic precision, and the Queen herself, in a pale blue coat, nodded approvingly. The vows were traditional, but there was a little hiccup. Diana accidentally mixed up Charles's names, calling him Philip Charles Arthur George instead of Charles Philip Arthur George. A slip of the tongue, sure, but some whispered it was a sign, an omen. Then there was the obey moment. Diana chose to omit the word obey from her vows, a small act of defiance that made headlines. The first royal bride to do so, she sent a clear message: this wasn't going to be a typical royal marriage. Or so she hoped. The balcony kiss at Buckingham Palace was the moment the world had been waiting for. The crowd roared, cameras clicked in a frenzied blur, and Charles leaned in, almost awkwardly, for a brief peck. The fairy tale seemed complete, but for Diana, it wasn't a fairy tale at all. Later, she would confess to a friend that it felt like an out-of-body experience, like she was watching herself from far away, playing a part in someone else's movie. And Charles, even as they waved to the crowds, his mind seemed elsewhere, perhaps drifting back to quiet moments with Camilla, to whispered jokes and private smiles far from the roar of the crowds. Let's pause for a curious little tidbit. Diana's bouquet included myrtle, a royal tradition that traces back to Queen Victoria's wedding in 1840. A sprig from the same plant is used in every royal bouquet, a symbol of love and marriage, yes, but also a reminder of continuity and invisible thread linking generations of royal brides. That same bouquet, however, seemed almost ironic as Diana stood beside a man whose heart belonged elsewhere. The reception was a blur of clinking glasses, awkward small talk, and carefully staged photos. Diana's father, John Spencer, beamed with pride, but Diana herself felt like she was drowning in a sea of strangers. She was now officially Her Royal Highness, the Princess of Wales, but behind the titles and the diamonds, she was still just a 20-year-old girl, and sure, overwhelmed. And already nursing a quiet ache. As the sun set on that golden day, the couple departed in a carriage, the crowd still cheering, the bells still ringing, and the cameras still flashing. It was a moment frozen in time, a perfect snapshot of royal romance. But if you look closely, you could see the cracks already forming tiny hairline fractures in the fairy tale that no amount of pageantry could hide. Diana, radiant in her gown, smiled and waved. But her heart, well, it wasn't entirely hers anymore. And Charles, he was already looking past the crowd, past the cameras, and perhaps just perhaps thinking about the one who wasn't there. The honeymoon was supposed to be the time when a new couple grows closer, but for Diana and Charles, it was more like a slow, quiet realization that they were already worlds apart. They sailed away on the royal yacht Britannia, with its polished decks and pristine linens, cutting through the blue Mediterranean like a floating palace. It should have been magical, and in the postcards, it certainly looked that way. Diana, sun-kissed in pastel dresses, her blonde hair gently tousled by the sea breeze, and Charles, in his crisp navy uniforms, standing at her side. But the real story, it was less romance, more polite distance. Diana found herself alone on deck, often staring at the sea, while Charles retreated to his cabin to read his beloved philosophy books. Lawrence van der Post, the South African mystic, was his current favorite, hardly the light honeymoon reading you'd expect. One crew member quietly remarked that Diana's laughter had an almost nervous edge, like someone trying to fill a silence that just wouldn't break. And when she wasn't battling seasickness, yes, she got terribly seasick on that pristine yacht, she was battling a sinking feeling that this wasn't what she had signed up for. Historians still debate whether this was the turning point when Diana realized that her marriage wasn't a love story, but a duty-bound arrangement. She later confided that Charles barely touched her during the honeymoon, and that their moments of intimacy felt more like obligations than expressions of affection. That's a harsh reality check for a woman who had just been paraded as the star of a global fairy tale. Meanwhile, Charles spent hours sketching and painting watercolors of the landscapes they visited. Beautiful, yes, but hardly the passionate honeymoon energy Diana had dreamed of. There was also the infamous moment when Diana found Charles's cufflinks, those same ones she had seen before, engraved with the interlocking CS for Camilla. She asked him about them, and Charles reportedly told her they were just a keepsake, something harmless, something old. Just a little token, right? But Diana knew better. It was like finding a lipstick stain on your partner's shirt, small, but impossible to ignore. And the phone calls. Even on the yacht, Diana overheard Charles on the phone with Camilla, speaking in soft, familiar tones that made her stomach twist. Imagine that on your honeymoon, your new husband is sneaking calls to another woman. Not exactly the blissful start Diana had pictured when she walked down the aisle. Diana tried to brush it off, to convince herself that maybe this was just how royal life worked. After all, she was new to the game, and the rules were unwritten. But the feeling of being an outsider, even in her own marriage, was starting to grow heavier, like an invisible cloak she couldn't take off. A quirky detail for you, Diana reportedly brought her favorite childhood teddy bear along on the honeymoon. A small, worn, comforting relic from a time when life was simpler. It sat quietly in her cabin, a silent witness to a young woman trying to hold on to something, anything that felt safe in a world suddenly spinning too fast. And so, the honeymoon passed, day by day, in a strange, quiet rhythm. Charles reading, painting, thinking of Camilla. Diana watching, waiting, wondering if she was already losing the man she had barely just begun to know. The yacht sailed on, cutting through the waves like a ship in a dream. But for Diana, the magic was already fading. By the time the honeymoon ended, it was clear that Diana and Charles weren't just two people in love, they were two entirely different worlds trying, and failing, to orbit the same star. Charles returned to his polo matches and country estate weekends, slipping back into a life of tweed jackets and whispered chats with Camilla. Diana, meanwhile, was left to navigate a royal calendar packed with hospital visits, charity galas, and ribbon cuttings, each event a photo op, each smile carefully arranged. From the outside, it looked perfect. The radiant young princess, poised and graceful, shaking hands with schoolchildren, visiting the sick, attending state dinners. But behind the palace doors, the tension crackled like static in the air. Diana wanted love, connection, warmth, thought Charles. He wanted respect, order, and a sense of duty. Their love languages were from entirely different dictionaries, and it showed. Diana craved physical affection, whispered conversations late into the night, a partner who would hold her close and listen. Charles preferred long walks alone, books on philosophy, and intellectual debates over quiet dinners. They were like two ships passing in the night, occasionally glancing across the water, but never quite docking at the same harbor. There's a quirky little detail you might not know. Charles loved gardening. He'd spend hours pottering about at Highgrove, planting trees, trimming hedges, and talking to the plants. Yes, literally, he'd speak to the trees and the flowers like they were old friends. Diana, on the other hand, once tried to join him but quickly grew bored, feeling like an extra in someone else's documentary. It was a small thing, but it spoke volumes. Charles's quiet, introspective world didn't have much room for Diana's vibrant energy. Historians still argue whether this mismatch was inevitable or whether they could have found common ground with the right support. Could they have learned each other's rhythms, found a shared beat, or was the gap too wide from the start, too much for even the most beautiful wedding to bridge, as Diana tried to carve out her place? She discovered she had a gift, a genuine warmth that connected her to the public in a way Charles never quite managed. She didn't just shake hands, she looked people in the eye, listened to their stories, touched them on the arm, held their hands a beat longer than protocol allowed. At a time when HIV/AIDS patients were shunned and feared, Diana made headlines by shaking hands with them. No gloves, no hesitation. That simple gesture sent shockwaves through a society gripped by fear. The cameras loved it. The public adored her. The palace, well, they weren't so sure. Diana's approach was fresh, modern, and deeply human, but it didn't always fit the polished, reserved image the monarchy had cultivated for centuries. Meanwhile, Charles seemed to grow more distant. At public events, Diana would be swarmed by adoring crowds, while Charles hovered awkwardly nearby, like a forgotten extra. Diana's star was rising, and Charles, the man born to be king, was struggling to keep up. His resentment simmered, quietly but steadily. It wasn't just jealousy, it was something deeper. Diana's charisma was natural, effortless. For Charles, every public smile felt like a performance, every handshake an obligation. And then there was the queen. Stoic, composed, the image of duty above all. She watched the growing strain with a stiff upper lip, rarely intervening. Her generation didn't do emotions. After all, the firm, as the royal family liked to call itself, was a machine. And Diana's tears, her very human vulnerability, didn't quite fit in the cogs and gears. So, the couple drifted. Diana desperate for connection, for affection, for a sense of belonging. Charles, retreating further into the quiet, curated world of Highgrove, of Camilla, of books and garden paths where the only voices were the ones he spoke to, the trees. And the world kept watching, seeing the smiles, the waves, the gowns, the jewels, but missing the heartbreak quietly blooming behind the palace walls. Camilla, by now, wasn't just a shadow on the edge of Diana's life. She was practically standing in the spotlight, albeit just out of frame. The thing was, she didn't even have to hide. She attended the same parties, the same polo matches, the same country weekends. Camilla was in the pictures, if not on the front page, then in the background, her smile a little too familiar, her gaze just a little too knowing. It wasn't subtle, and it certainly wasn't a secret, not really. You could almost imagine the palace walls themselves whispering about her. The staff knew, friends knew, and Diana definitely knew. There's a particular scene people love to recall. At a charity event, Diana arrived in a black velvet gown that turned heads, a true look-at-me moment. But there, across the room, was Camilla dressed in a demure floral dress, chatting with Charles like they were the only two people who mattered. Diana later said it felt like the air left the room, like she was a ghost haunting her own life. And let's talk about the famous three of us in this marriage moment. Diana dropped that bombshell during the now infamous 1995 BBC Panorama interview. But long before that, she felt it deep in her bones, in the way Charles's eyes softened when he spoke to Camilla, and the half-finished sentences, the unexplained absences, the phone calls in hushed tones. It was an open secret, the kind that gnaws at you quietly until you can't breathe. Imagine walking into a room and seeing your husband laughing with another woman, a private joke you're not part of, again and again and again. That was Diana's reality. Historians still debate whether Charles truly tried to keep Camilla secret or whether he simply didn't care who noticed. Some say he was careless. Others argue he was arrogant. Either way, Camilla's presence was like a splinter under Diana's skin, small but impossible to ignore. There's a quirky little detail from this era. Charles reportedly carried a photo of Camilla in his diary, tucked between notes on engagements and speeches. A tiny, private memento in a life ruled by public duty. It's a strange thought, isn't it? A man who would one day be king, flipping through official briefings, glancing at a photograph of the woman he wasn't supposed to love. For Diana, the pain wasn't just emotional, it was physical. Her bulimia worsened. She lost weight rapidly, and her staff became increasingly alarmed. One former bodyguard later said that Diana would sometimes binge on cakes and sweets, then vanish for hours, returning pale and shaken. It was her way of coping, a desperate attempt to control something, anything, and a life where even her clothes were chosen by others. And yet, at public events, she smiled and waved, a porcelain doll in designer gowns, while the cameras flashed and the headlines praised her beauty. Meanwhile, Charles and Camilla continued their quiet dance, their connection so deeply rooted that it didn't matter how many cameras pointed at Diana. Charles would send Camilla notes, gifts, small tokens that spoke volumes. The public might not have seen them, but Diana did. Every small gesture chipped away at her heart, a reminder that she was playing the role of the beloved princess, but the leading lady in her husband's life had always been someone else. And so, the walls of Kensington Palace held a strange tension. Diana, the shining star in public, lonely and hurting in private. Charles, the prince in waiting, steadfast in his routine, but emotionally distant. And Camilla, the woman in the shadows, quietly holding her place. It was a love triangle played out in front of the world, yet somehow invisible to those who didn't know where to look. But for Diana, the ache was constant. It wasn't just that Charles had another woman, it was that she was expected to smile through it all, to keep calm and carry on, as if the cracks in her marriage were just part of the job description. And each time she saw Camilla, each time Charles slipped away for a weekend at Highgrove, the fracture lines deepened, spreading through her life like cracks in fine china, waiting for the inevitable shatter. It wasn't long before the cracks in Charles and Diana's marriage stopped being whispers and started echoing through the grand halls of the palace and splashing across tabloid covers. What had been subtle tension became open friction. Their arguments, once held behind closed doors, began spilling into public view, a simmering war of icy glances, clipped words, and awkward body language that even the casual observer could pick up on. It wasn't just the tabloids sniffing out the drama. Staff, friends, and even foreign dignitaries began to notice. Diana's smile, once warm and genuine, grew tight. Charles's patience wore thin, his charm dimming into a weary, half-hearted duty. One infamous moment stands out like a cracked vase on a mantelpiece. During a royal visit to India in 1992, the couple posed for a photo in front of the Taj Mahal, a place known as a monument to eternal love. But Charles wasn't there beside Diana. Instead, she sat alone on the marble bench, her expression wistful and distant, as if the weight of the world had settled on her shoulders. The image went viral before viral was even a thing, splashed across newspapers with captions like "Alone at the Taj." Diana later said it was a deeply sad moment, while Charles, off somewhere else, probably thought the trip had gone just fine. Historians still argue whether Charles intentionally distanced himself from Diana during that visit, or whether he genuinely didn't see how much she was hurting. Either way, the message was clear. Their love story was crumbling, one awkward photo op at a time. And then there were the leaked tapes. Oh yes, the tapes. First came Squidgygate, a recording of Diana's private, flirtatious conversation with a close friend. The press had a field day, cheeky headlines, endless speculation. But that was just the appetizer. The main course was the infamous Camillagate tape, a recording of Charles and Camilla whispering sweet nothings over the phone. The world was treated to Charles expressing his desire to be, well, a certain hygiene product in Camilla's life. If you know, you know. It was awkward, it was cringeworthy, and it was a brutal public confirmation of what Diana had known all along. Charles's heart had never truly been hers. Diana's response wasn't to fade quietly into the background. No, she fought back in her own way, using fashion as armor. Her dresses became statements, bold colors, daring necklines, and that unforgettable revenge dress moment at the Serpentine Gallery in 1994. It was as if she was saying, "You might have broken my heart, but you will not dim my light." And the public loved it. Every appearance became an event, every outfit a headline. Meanwhile, Charles looked increasingly like a man who had lost control of the narrative. He couldn't compete with Diana's star power, and he knew it. But behind the glamour, Diana's mental health was in freefall. The bulimia, the self-harm, the desperate phone calls to friends late at night, those were the parts of the story the public didn't see, or didn't want to see. Diana was drowning in loneliness, trapped in a gilded cage, while the cameras clicked and the world cheered. She once told a friend, "I'm just a sad person in a beautiful dress." And wasn't that the truth? A quirky detail here: Diana would often play pop songs in her apartment at Kensington Palace, dancing alone to George Michael and Duran Duran, trying to shake off the sadness. She loved 80s hits, the upbeat tunes, a sharp contrast to the gloom settling over her personal life. It was her own quiet rebellion, a reminder that she was still young, still alive, still fighting. And so, the world watched as the once perfect royal couple began to fray. Their arguments no longer whispered behind palace walls but splashed across front pages. The image of the fairy tale princess was beginning to crack, and through those cracks, a new roar. More human Diana was emerging, flawed, vulnerable, and heartbreakingly real. Diana's heartbreak wasn't just confined to quiet tears behind palace doors. It bubbled over, turning into whispers, rumors, and, eventually, bold, defiant steps into the arms of others. If Charles could have his secret world with Camilla, why couldn't she find a little happiness too? That's the thing about love, it doesn't play by the rules, not even royal ones. Enter James Hewitt, a dashing cavalry officer with a chiseled jawline, a shock of ginger hair, and the kind of polished charm that seemed to sweep Diana off her feet. He was a riding instructor, hired to teach Diana equestrian skills, but it wasn't long before the lessons turned into long, lingering afternoons, whispered conversations, and, eventually, a full-blown affair. Diana later admitted it, saying, "James was a great friend at a time when I needed one." Historians still debate just how serious the relationship was. Some say it was a fleeting comfort. Others argue it was the closest Diana ever came to finding true love after her marriage crumbled. There's a quirky tidbit here. Hewitt once told an interviewer that Diana loved his car, a bright red convertible, and they would sometimes drive off together into the countryside, windows down, music blasting, Diana laughing like a carefree schoolgirl. Imagine that, Britain's most famous woman, hair whipping in the wind, singing along to pop songs in a flashy sports car, if only for a moment. But Hewitt wasn't the only one. There were whispers of other relationships. To art dealer Oliver Hoare, heart surgeon Hasnat Khan, the so-called love of her life, and eventually Dodi Fade, the Egyptian film producer with whom she would later share those famous, fateful yacht photos. For Diana, each of these men represented a chance to feel seen, loved, wanted. They were a salve for the wounds Charles had left, and for the suffocating loneliness that came with being the world's most photographed woman. Charles, of course, knew. He wasn't blind to Diana's affairs, and the irony wasn't lost on anyone. The future king, who had carried on his own secret relationship for years, now watched his wife stepping outside the lines, and it bruised his ego more than his heart. He once reportedly told friends, "She's making a spectacle of herself," as if forgetting the spectacle he had made long before. The pot calling the kettle black, royal edition. The press, naturally, had a field day. Diana was photographed in gyms, at restaurants, leaving private homes, her every move scrutinized, analyzed, and speculated upon, and she knew it. Sometimes she even seemed to court the attention, using the cameras to send subtle messages, a well-timed smile here, a coy glance there. Historians still argue whether Diana was manipulating the press or simply trying to reclaim a sliver of control in a life where so little was truly hers. And yet, for all the headlines and the scandal, Diana's pain was very real. She once described her life as a living hell, the constant pressure, the public scrutiny, the private betrayal, all of it grinding her down. Her relationships with other men weren't just about revenge. In a strange way, Diana and Charles were mirrors of each other, both seeking comfort outside their marriage, both trapped in a cycle of longing and disappointment, both too broken to bridge the gap between them. And so, the saga continued. Diana, the woman who had captured the world's heart, tangled in a web of forbidden loves, while Charles retreated further into the arms of Camilla, and the monarchy tried desperately to keep the facade of a perfect royal family intact. but the cracks were widening, and the question wasn't if it would all come crashing down, it was when. Diana wasn't going to fade quietly into the background, and by the early 1990s, she had learned how to fight back not with swords or sharp words, but with interviews, fashion, and a carefully sharpened sense of her own power. If Charles could have Camilla, Diana could have the world's sympathy, and she knew it. The public adored her, the media followed her every move, and the monarchy, well, they were starting to look like the bad guys in a fairy tale they thought they controlled. One of Diana's boldest moves was that 1995 BBC Panorama interview, where she sat down with journalist Martin Bashir in a quiet Kensington Palace drawing room and dropped bombshells that shook the monarchy to its core. She spoke with a kind of raw and filtered honesty that was rare for a royal, maybe too rare. "There were 3 of us in this marriage," she said softly, her voice steady, but her eyes shining with the kind of hurt you can't fake. It was the moment the facade shattered. The carefully cultivated image of the dutiful princess dissolved in an instant, replaced by a woman speaking her truth to the world. Diana admitted to her own infidelities, spoke of her bulimia, and described how she had felt isolated and unsupported by the royal family. Historians still debate whether she was manipulated by Bashir, whether he used forged documents and underhanded tactics to secure the interview, but one thing is clear: Diana knew exactly what she wanted to say. And once the words were out, there was no going back. Fashion became another weapon in Diana's quiet war. That revenge dress, the off-the-shoulder black silk number she wore to a Vanity Fair party the very night Charles publicly confessed his affair with Camilla, wasn't just an outfit. It was a statement, a moment of defiance wrapped in fabric. The world gasped, cameras flashed, and Charles, wherever he was, surely felt the sting. Diana wasn't just surviving, she was thriving, in her own way. Even her everyday wardrobe choices sent messages. The shorter hemlines, the bold colors, the sleek, modern silhouettes. This wasn't the shy girl from 1981 anymore. Diana was rewriting the script, and the public couldn't get enough. Magazines sold out when she was on the cover, designers clamored to dress her, and women all over the world copied her hair, her eyeliner, her sense of casual chic. She was, in a sense, a one-woman brand, decades before Instagram influencers were a thing. But it wasn't just about the clothes or the interviews, it was about reclaiming her narrative. For so long, Diana had been defined by others: the naive bride, the wronged wife, the tragic princess. Now, she was taking back the pen and writing her own story. And yet, the price was steep. The royal family closed ranks, the Queen growing colder, Charles growing more distant, the courtiers whispering behind closed doors about Diana's instability, her unpredictability, her refusal to play by the rules. There's a quirky little detail from this period: Diana reportedly loved astrology and would consult her astrologer, Penny Thornton, before big decisions. Whether to accept an invitation, what to wear, how to navigate tricky family dynamics, she'd ask for guidance in the stars. It's a fascinating glimpse into how she tried to find some sense of control in a life that often felt like a runaway train. And still, Diana fought on. She threw herself into charity work, particularly with AIDS patients and landmine victims, using her star power to shine light on causes others were too scared to touch. Her empathy was genuine, her hugs real, her willingness to connect with the suffering unfiltered by royal protocol. The public saw it, felt it, and loved her for it. Meanwhile, Charles' dignified, proper, reserved struggled to match her warmth. Historians still argue whether the monarchy could have survived this era without Diana's influence. Was she their greatest asset or their greatest threat? In the end, Diana's fight wasn't just about Charles, Camilla, or the cold gaze of the palace. It was about being seen, being heard, being loved on her own terms. And for a while, it seemed like she was winning, at least in the court of public opinion. But as we'll see, even a princess who learns to fight back can always outrun the consequences. As Diana's star soared, Charles's public image began to wobble, sometimes quietly, sometimes with a spectacular crash. It wasn't just the affair with Camilla, though that was certainly the headline grabber. It was the way Charles seemed increasingly out of touch, a man playing a part in a story that had moved on without him. While Diana was out visiting hospitals, hugging children with AIDS, and walking through minefields in Angola, Charles was planting trees, talking about architecture, and, yes, still playing polo. To be fair, Charles wasn't entirely the villain history often paints him as. He had causes to sustainability, organic farming, the preservation of historic buildings. In many ways, he was ahead of his time, a passionate advocate for the environment before eco-friendly was a buzzword. But here's the thing, that's not what people wanted from their fairy tale prince. They wanted charm, warmth, a man who could match Diana's glow. And Charles, he just wasn't that guy. Historians still argue whether he was misunderstood, a deep thinker trapped in a world that demanded surface-level sparkle, or whether he was simply too self-absorbed to see the impact of his choices. Public appearances told the story in 1,000 unspoken ways. Diana would arrive at events, radiant, magnetic, with crowds surging to touch her, to see her, to feel that spark. Charles, he'd shake hands, give polite speeches, and stand awkwardly to the side as Diana worked the room. It became a running joke. Charles, the man who was born to be king, reduced to a supporting act in his own life. And it grated on him. Friends later said he resented how Diana outshone him, how she became the star while he faded into the background. There's a quirky detail here that says a lot. Charles once said he'd rather be a tampon than a monarch. Yes, really. In that infamous phone call with Camilla, the line slipped out, and the world cringed. It was an awkward, too personal glimpse into a man who, for all his titles and centuries-old lineage, still longed for something ordinary, something human. And yet, that's the paradox, isn't it? Charles wanted to be seen as a relatable figure, but every time he opened his mouth, he seemed to dig the hole deeper. His sense of humor, his intellectual musings, his love of the countryside, none of it quite clicked with a public that was enchanted by Diana's effortless warmth and vulnerability. The royal family tried to manage the optics. There were photo ops of Charles and Diana together, sometimes with the boys, William and Harry, trying to project an image of unity. But those smiles were often strained, the body language stiff, and the cracks impossible to plaster over. Behind closed doors, things were even messier. Diana once described her life as a walking headline, and for Charles, that meant constant frustration. His private life wasn't private anymore, and his public life felt like a stage where Diana stole every scene. Diana's allies in the press only made things worse for Charles. Leaks, whispers, carefully placed stories that painted him as cold, distant, a man trapped in his own self-importance. Meanwhile, Diana's image grew more sympathetic, more glamorous, more untouchable. She was the people's princess, while Charles was, well, just the prince. Even the queen seemed exasperated, reportedly telling aides that enough is enough. But Charles, caught between duty, love, and damage control, seemed paralyzed. His PR team scrambled to reshape his image, emphasizing his dedication to his charities, his work ethic, his role as a father. But it wasn't enough. The public had already chosen their side. And Diana, she knew exactly what she was doing. Every carefully timed photo, every knowing glance to the camera, every subtle nod to her struggles, it was a masterclass in media manipulation. Not in a sinister way, but in a way that said, I see you watching, and I want you to see me, the real me. Historians still debate whether Diana's media strategy was deliberate genius or emotional instinct, but either way, it worked. So, Charles's image wobbled, and Diana's star kept rising. And all the while, the palace seemed to tremble, caught between tradition and the undeniable pull of a very modern woman who wasn't going to play by the old rules. It became the ultimate battle of public opinion, Team Diana versus Team Charles, and let's be honest, the playing field wasn't exactly level. Diana had the charm, the charisma, and the cameras practically worshipping her. Charles, he had centuries of royal protocol, but that didn't exactly translate into public affection. The British press, always hungry for drama, gobbled it up. Tabloid headlines pitted them against each other like gladiators in a coliseum. Princess of Hearts they called Diana, while Charles, well, he got the less flattering labels, the cold husband, the loser, the man who let down the woman everyone adored. And Diana wasn't just a passive participant in this game. She knew how to work the cameras, how to give a subtle glance or a half smile that sent 1,000 flashbulbs firing. Remember that moment in 1992 when she stepped out in a sleek red dress at a charity event just days after the separation announcement? That wasn't a coincidence. Diana understood the power of an image in a way the monarchy, with all its stiff formality, simply couldn't match. Historians still argue whether she deliberately orchestrated these moments, or whether it was simply her natural instinct shining through. But either way, it worked. Charles, meanwhile, seemed increasingly cornered. His friends tried to defend him, releasing statements about his deep commitment to his royal duties and his quiet, thoughtful nature. They highlighted his environmental work, his charity initiatives, his passion for architecture. But none of it seemed to stick. When the public looked at Charles, they didn't see a thoughtful intellectual. They saw the man who had broken Diana's heart. Every step he took, every word he spoke, was filtered through that lens, and he couldn't escape it. Even the Queen began to feel the heat. There were whispers in the palace that something had to give. The monarchy's reputation was at risk. And the growing tabloid circus was starting to feel less like a royal soap opera and more like a full-blown scandal that could shake the very foundations of the sea. Roan. After all, it wasn't just a private matter anymore. It was front-page news every day. Diana's struggles, Charles's affair, the growing distance between them, it was all out there, laid bare for the world to see. And the public, bless them, had opinions. Letters poured into newspapers, radio hosts debated the War of the Wallises, and every appearance by either Diana or Charles was dissected like a royal autopsy. There's a quirky little detail that often gets missed. At one point, bookmakers were actually taking bets on whether Charles and Diana would officially divorce, and what date it might happen. Imagine that, placing a bet on the dissolution of a royal marriage, as if it were a horse race or a football match. It sounds absurd, but it speaks volumes about how invested the public had become in their saga. And then there were the moments when the tension boiled over in public. Diana giving interviews, her eyes wide and vulnerable, speaking about her pain, her struggles, her love for her children. Charles, in turn, stiffly defending himself in carefully worded statements, his voice clipped, his body language defensive. Each side had its loyalists. Some saw Diana as the wronged woman, others as manipulative and unstable. Some saw Charles as a victim of palace tradition, others as a cold, selfish man who had chosen duty over love. Historians still debate whether this battle for hearts and minds was ever winnable for Charles. Was he simply outmatched from the start, or did his own choices doom him in the court of public opinion? And through it all, the boys William and Harry stood in the middle, two young princes caught in a media storm they never asked for. Their mother, the star. Their father, the future king. The headlines, the whispers, the relentless cameras. It wasn't just a public story. It was their childhood, played out on the front pages for the world to watch. So the war raged on. Diana, the people's princess, dazzling and wounded. Charles, there, steady but struggling. The monarchy, the institution, trying to hold it all together with an iron grip and a stiff upper lip. But the cracks were showing, and the world was watching, waiting for the next chapter in the royal drama that had become too big, too messy, to ignore. The Queen had been patient, stoic, even, but patience has its limits, especially when the family business starts to look like a soap opera, and the royal brand begins to tarnish. The firm, as they called themselves behind palace walls, wasn't just a family. It was an institution, a machine that had to keep running smoothly, no matter the scandal, no matter the headlines. And Diana and Charles's very public breakdown, that wasn't just a personal issue anymore. It was a threat to the entire system. So, in December 1992, after years of whispers, arguments, and front-page drama, the Queen finally stepped in with a quiet, but firm message. It was time to separate. Historians still argue whether the Queen acted out of genuine concern for her son, for the institution, or just to stop the bleeding of the monarchy's image. Some say she was deeply distressed by the emotional toll it was taking on William and Harry, while others believe it was purely about damage control and an attempt to contain the mess before it spread even further. Either way, the result was the same. Charles and Diana's separation was announced in the House of Commons, no less, by Prime Minister John Major. Imagine that your marriage declared over in the halls of government, like a policy change or a budget cut. The statement was polite, clinical even, emphasizing that the couple had no plans to divorce at that time and that they would continue to co-parent their children. But behind the carefully crafted words, everyone knew the truth. The fairy tale was over, and the crown had ordered it so. Diana was devastated, at least. That's what her friends later said. She had fought so hard, endured so much, and now it felt like the palace was washing its hands of her, pushing her out of the inner circle. The separation meant she kept her title as Princess of Wales, but her role in royal life was complicated. She was still invited to some events, still smiled and waved from balconies, but the warmth, the inclusion, was fading. She was an insider-outsider, now a princess, yes, but no longer part of the royal machine. Charles, on the other hand, seemed relieved. Freed from the constant drama, he retreated to Highgrove, surrounded by his dogs, his gardens, and, of course, Camilla. They saw each other more openly now, though still not officially as a couple. Camilla, ever the discreet presence, avoided public events, but those in royal circles knew. Everyone knew. It was just a matter of time before the truth became impossible to ignore. There's a quirky little detail about this period. When the separation was announced, Diana reportedly received flowers from Elton John, who had become a close friend. They had bonded over their shared experiences with fame and loss. Imagine that, a pop icon sending a princess flowers after her marriage falls apart. It's the kind of image you'd expect in a movie, but this was real life, playing out on the front pages. For the monarchy, the separation was a calculated risk. They hoped it would cool the media frenzy, give Charles and Diana space to rebuild their lives, and allow the royal family to return to a semblance of normalcy. But if anything, it only fueled the fire. Diana, now semi-detached from the palace, was more of a wild card than ever. She gave interviews, spoke her mind, and continued to capture the public's imagination in a way that no other royal could. Her every move, what she wore, who she was seen with, what she said, was dissected in the press. Meanwhile, Charles tried to reshape his image, but without Diana by his side, he seemed a bit lost, like a man trying to play a role he hadn't quite rehearsed for. And then there were the children, William and Harry, caught in the middle of it all. Their parents' separation wasn't just a private matter, it was a national spectacle. They watched as the world took sides, as newspapers speculated about their future, as photographers camped outside their school gates. It was, in many ways, the price of being royal, but for two young boys, it must have felt like a cage, no matter how gilded. The Queen, ever composed, carried on with her public duties, but even she couldn't ignore the growing sense that the monarchy was teetering on the edge of something dangerous. The separation wasn't the end of the story, it was just the next chapter. And the storm, if anything, was still gathering strength. Once the separation was formalized, it was like a slow-motion chess match, carefully calculated, sometimes petty, and always with an eye on public perception. The legal side of things was messy, because this wasn't just any couple splitting up. This was the heir to the British throne and the mother of a future king. Every detail of the divorce negotiations was weighed against centuries of tradition, legal precedents, and, of course, the ever-watchful eye of the press. Diana wanted her independence financially, emotionally, and in terms of her public role. Charles wanted to protect the crown, his position, and, let's be honest, whatever was left of his dignity. Lawyers and advisors from both sides huddled in quiet rooms, drafting agreements that read like battle plans. Who would get what properties, what titles, what access? Who would pay for security, travel, staff? Historians still argue whether the palace deliberately dragged out the process to wear Diana down, or whether it was just the sheer complexity of entangling a royal marriage that took so long. One particularly sticky point was Diana's title. Would she still be Her Royal Highness? The answer ultimately, no. The Queen agreed that Diana could remain the Princess of Wales, but without the HRH style. That might sound like a small detail, but in royal terms, it was monumental. Without the HRH, Diana would technically have to curtsy to her ex-husband and even her own sons. Think about that for a second, having to bow to your own children. It's a small, cruel symbol of how far she had fallen in the eyes of the firm. Diana reportedly fought hard to keep the title, but Charles was firm. Losing the HRH wasn't just about protocol, it was about power, a subtle but sharp reminder that while Diana was beloved by the public, she was no longer part of the royal machine. And the public noticed. When the news broke, letters flooded in outraged, sympathetic, heartbroken for the woman who had once seemed destined to be queen. There's a quirky little detail from the negotiations. Diana reportedly wanted to keep her Kensington Palace apartment, apartment 8, where she had raised William and Harry. That was her sanctuary, her home base, and the palace agreed. She would remain at Kensington, while Charles would retreat to Highgrove, his country estate, surrounded by his dogs, horses, and, of course, Camilla. The financial settlement. Diana walked away with a lump sum estimated at around £17 million, plus a stipend for maintaining her private office. That sounds like a fortune, and it was, but in the context of royal wealth, it was carefully calculated, enough to secure her lifestyle, but not enough to overshadow the future king. It was, as one royal insider put it, a golden handshake to make her go quietly. But Diana, quiet was never her style. Even as the legal dust settled, she continued to step out in front of cameras, her smile a little sharper, her dresses a little bolder, her presence as captivating as ever. The divorce papers were signed in August 1996, and just like that, Diana was no longer a royal in the official sense. But to the public, she was still their princess. That connection couldn't be erased with a legal document or a stripped title. Charles, meanwhile, tried to project an image of calm, but those close to him said he felt a sense of relief, and awkward, quiet relief, tinged with regret but also with a sense that the storm had, at least temporarily, passed. He and Camilla could breathe a little easier, though they still kept their relationship somewhat under wraps. The world wasn't quite ready for that next chapter. And then there was the Queen, watching it all unfold with that signature composed expression. Historians still debate whether she felt pity for Diana, frustration at the media circus, or simply a weary sense that the institution had survived yet another storm. So the legal chess match ended not with a checkmate, but with a quiet and easy draw. Diana free but no longer royal. Charles, technically entangled but still weighed down by public disapproval. And the monarchy, still standing, but forever changed by the drama, the heartbreak, and the woman who refused to go quietly into the night. Caught between the storm of their parents' crumbling marriage were the two boys William and Harry, who had no say in the matter but bore the weight of it all. They were just kids, really. William, there, quiet and thoughtful even at a young age. Harry, the spare, a little more impulsive, a little more mischievous, as younger siblings often are. They had grown up in the grand rooms of Kensington Palace and Highgrove, surrounded by nannies and bodyguards, but they were also just two children who wanted their mum and dad to get along. When Diana and Charles finally separated, the boys became emotional hostages in a battle neither of them asked for. The world watched them at school gates, at holiday photo ops, at Trooping the Color, their young faces carefully schooled in royal composure but occasionally betraying a flicker of confusion, or sadness, or just plain exhaustion. Historians still argue how much they understood at the time. Were they fully aware of the depth of their parents' unhappiness, or did they simply feel the tension, the constant, brittle energy in every room they entered? Diana, ever the warm, hands-on mum, tried to shield them. She took them to theme parks, to fast food chains, to the movies, normal, everyday places where they could forget, for a little while, that they were the most famous children in the world. William once told a friend that his mother's hugs were the best, tight, all-encompassing, like she was trying to hold him together even as she herself was falling apart. And Harry, he once joked that Diana would let them eat McDonald's in front of the TV, hardly royal protocol, but that's who she was, a mum first, a princess second. Charles, to his credit, tried too. He took them hiking, fishing, and instilled in them his love for the countryside. But there was always a sense that his affection was a little more formal, a little more reserved. He loved them, of course, but the hugs came less frequently, the conversations a bit more filtered. Charles was a man raised by a generation that didn't do emotions, and it showed. There's a quirky little detail that's often overlooked. When William was born, Diana wanted him to have as normal an upbringing as possible. She insisted he go to nursery school, not be tutored in the palace, and even took him along on royal tours, something that had never been done before. It was her way of breaking the mold, of trying to give her children a taste of real life beyond the palace gates. And it worked, to a point. But no amount of McDonald's runs or Disney movies could fully shield them from the storm swirling around their family. And the press, they were relentless. Every photo of the boys became a prize, whether they were arriving at Eden, on a ski trip with Charles, or holding their mother's hand at a charity event. Diana was keenly aware of this, sometimes playing the game, sometimes trying to protect them. William once reportedly told photographers to leave Mummy alone, the heartbreaking moment of a child trying to guard his mother from a world that wouldn't stop watching. Historians still debate the long-term impact of this chaos on William and Harry. Some say it forged a fierce bond between them and us against the world mentality that would shape their adult lives. Others argue that it left deep scars, a sense of distrust, a lingering resentment toward both the media and the institution that put duty above family. One thing is certain, the boys loved their mother fiercely. They saw her as the soft place to land in a world that often felt cold and formal. When Diana and Charles divorced, the custody arrangements were carefully negotiated. William and Harry would spend time with both parents, but there was no escaping the fact that their lives were forever split. School holidays became logistical puzzles, birthdays and Christmases a balancing act of divided loyalties. And through it all, the cameras kept clicking, the world kept watching, and two young boys tried to grow up under the weight of crowns they hadn't yet inherited but could already feel pressing down. So while the adults played their chess game, the children lived in the crossfire, their smiles practiced, their hands held a little too tightly, their futures shaped by decisions they had no say in. And in the quiet moments, when the cameras were off, they were just two sons who wanted their family back, even if they couldn't say it out loud. The divorce, when it finally came, wasn't announced with fanfare or fireworks. It was signed quietly, a set of legal documents inked on August 28, 1996, 15 years after that grand wedding watched by the world. The headlines were there, of course, but it almost felt like the end of a long, weary sigh rather than a dramatic finale. The fairy tale had been over 4 years. This was just the paperwork catching up. Diana, officially no longer Her Royal Highness, kept the title of Princess of Wales. It was a small victory, but a bittersweet one. The HRH had been a painful loss technically. It meant she'd have to curtsy to her ex-husband, even to her own sons. And yet, when the public saw Diana, they didn't care about titles. To them, she was still their princess. The woman who had held AIDS patients' hands, who had embraced landmine victims, who had smiled and waved when her heart was breaking. No royal decree could erase that. As for Charles, he returned to his carefully cultivated world. Highgrove, Camilla, the charities, the speeches. There was no public triumph in the divorce for him, just a quiet, almost embarrassed retreat. Historians still debate whether Charles felt relief or regret in those final days. Some say he was grateful the nightmare of public humiliation was over. Others argue he mourned the failure of his marriage, even if it had long been a hollow shell. One thing's certain, he was now free, at least on paper, but the public's opinion of him had taken a lasting hit. And Diana, she walked away not just from a marriage, but from an entire way of life. She was no longer bound by the strictures of the firm, no longer obliged to attend state banquets or smile politely at the Queen's side. She was, in many ways, finally free. But freedom, as it turned out, was complicated. The cameras didn't stop following her. If anything, they became even more relentless. Every outing, every holiday, every dinner date was scrutinized. Paparazzi swarmed her like bees, their lenses hungry for a glimpse of the woman who had captivated the world. Diana, ever the people's princess, tried to navigate this new chapter. She refocused her energy on her charities, becoming an even more outspoken advocate for causes like HIV/AIDS awareness and the campaign to ban landmines. Her trips to hospitals, orphanages, and war zones became iconic moments, proof that she wasn't just a figurehead, but a force for change. There's a quirky detail from this period. Diana once auctioned off 79 of her dresses for charity, raising over $5.7 million. Can you imagine? Gowns that had once been the talk of royal balls now sold to the highest bidder, their proceeds going to help others. It was a bold, almost symbolic shedding of her old life. And yet, for all the good she did, there was an undeniable sadness that lingered around her. Diana admitted in interviews that she longed for love, for a sense of belonging that had always seemed just out of reach. She wanted to be more than just the ex-wife of the future king. She wanted to be seen, to be loved, to be her own person. When she walked out of Kensington Palace for the last time as a royal, Diana wasn't just leaving a marriage, she was stepping into an uncertain future, one where she had no official role. No set path, just a whirlwind of flashbulbs, a deep well of compassion, and a fragile, still healing heart. The divorce was final, yes, but Diana's story, that was far from over. The ink was dry, the papers signed, and the world moved on. But for Diana, and for the millions who had followed her journey, the fairy tale hadn't ended with happily ever after. It had ended with a signature, a sigh, and a question. What happens to the princess when the crown is no longer hers to wear? Life after the divorce was a strange, glittering limbo for Diana. It was like being a star without a constellation, floating bright and alone in the night sky. And Diana, ever the seeker of connection, wasn't about to settle into quiet obscurity. No, she embraced her newfound freedom with a kind of fierce, sometimes chaotic energy. She appeared at events that were far removed from the palace corridors she once walked. There were glamorous galas in New York, charity functions in London, and yes, those famous holidays on yachts, gliding across the Mediterranean in oversized sunglasses and designer swimsuits. The cameras followed her everywhere, lounging on deck, laughing with friends, her golden hair blowing in the sea breeze. Those images became iconic, plastered across magazines and TV screens, a visual declaration that Diana was still the princess of the people, even if she wasn't a princess in title. And then, of course, there was Dodi Fayed, the son of billionaire Mohammed Al Fayed. Dodi was charming, wealthy, and willing to sweep Diana off her feet in a whirlwind of luxury. They were photographed on his father's yacht, laughing, holding hands, sharing kisses on sun-drenched decks. To the world, it looked like a fairy tale reboot. Diana, radiant and carefree, finally finding happiness after years of heartbreak. But behind the scenes, it was more complicated. Friends later said Diana was conflicted, drawn to Dodi's affection, but unsure about the intensity of the relationship. Historians still argue whether she truly loved him or whether she was caught up in the excitement of being wanted, of being adored. Meanwhile, Charles's life after the divorce took a different, quieter turn. He continued his work with his charities, focusing on causes like organic farming and architecture, and spent more time at Highgrove with Camilla, who, slowly but surely, began to emerge from the shadows. No longer just the other woman, Camilla became Charles's companion in a more public sense, though the palace still tried to manage their image carefully. For years, she was referred to in the press as his close friend, a label that fooled no one but kept up appearances. Charles's relationship with the public, however, was still a delicate dance. While Diana had retained her role as the world's darling, Charles struggled to repair his image. Historians still debate whether he ever truly won the public back or whether, in the eyes of many, he remained the man who had broken Diana's heart. His relationship with Camilla, while steady, was met with a mix of acceptance and lingering resentment. The public might have moved on, but they didn't forget. Diana, for her part, was still figuring out what her new life meant. She threw herself into her charity work with even greater passion: landmine awareness, AIDS advocacy, children's hospitals, causes that truly mattered to her. There's a quirky detail from this time. Diana became an unofficial ambassador for acupuncture, swearing by its benefits for stress relief and overall wellness. Imagine that: Diana, the former Princess of Wales, lying on a treatment table, needles delicately placed along her meridians, trying to find a little peace in a life that had so often been anything but peaceful. Yet for all her new experiences, there was an undercurrent of restlessness in Diana's life. Friends described her as searching, always searching for love, for purpose, for a sense of belonging that had eluded her for so long. She had millions of admirers, but in the quiet moments, she was still Diana, alone in her apartment at Kensington Palace, still listening to her favorite pop songs, still dreaming of a future that seemed just out of reach. And so, the story moved forward: Diana, radiant but restless, and Charles, steady but scarred. To people who had once stood at the altar together, now moving in separate orbits, their lives still tangled by the threads of their past. The cameras never stopped clicking, the world never stopped watching, and the next chapter was already writing itself, one final, devastating twist waiting just beyond the horizon. The final chapter of Diana's story came with a sudden, shattering force, a moment that froze the world in grief. It was the last day of August 1997, a humid night in Paris, and Diana and Dodi Fade were leaving the Ritz Hotel, cameras flashing, paparazzi swarming like moths to a flame. They slid into the back of a black Mercedes, trying to outrun the relentless photographers. The driver, Henry Paul, a Ritz security manager, pushed the car hard through the Paris streets, speeding toward the Pont de l'Alma tunnel. What happened next is etched into history. The Mercedes crashed into the 13th pillar at high speed, crumpling like a tin can under the weight of fate. Dodi and Henry Paul died instantly. Diana was pulled from the wreckage, still alive, but barely. She was rushed to the Petit-Salpêtrière hospital, and despite frantic efforts to save her, the world lost its princess in the early hours of August 31st. The news hit like a thunderclap, rippling across time zones and languages, leaving millions stunned and heartbroken. Historians still debate the circumstances of that night, whether the paparazzi truly played a role in the crash, whether security measures were sufficient, whether Diana's death could have been prevented if different choices had been made. The inquestors later ruled it as an unlawful killing due to the driver's intoxication and the chasing paparazzi, but the theories, though, they still swirl. Was it a tragic accident, or was there something darker at play? Conspiracy theories bloomed like nightshade, toxic and persistent. Some claimed the royal family wanted her gone, that Diana knew too much, that she was a threat. The truth, for most, is simpler and sadder. A woman hounded by cameras, desperate for love, lost in the chaos of a life that had spun far beyond her control. The public mourning was like nothing anyone had ever seen. Outside Kensington Palace, the sea of flowers grew taller than people. Teddy bears, handwritten notes, candles, photographs, an ocean of grief from a public that had claimed Diana as their own. News anchors struggled to keep composure as they read the updates. Celebrities, politicians, everyday people, all stunned, all united in shock. Elton John, her friend, rewrote his song Candle in the Wind in her memory, performing it at her funeral in Westminster Abbey, a haunting, heartbreaking tribute watched by an estimated 2.5 billion people around the world. That's nearly half the planet, pausing to say goodbye. Charles, caught in the middle of duty and guilt, flew to Paris to retrieve Diana's body, a gesture seen by some as too little, too late. William and Harry, just 15 and 12, walked behind their mother's coffin in the funeral procession, their faces pale and solemn, their eyes hollow with grief. That image, two young boys, walking behind the woman they loved most in the world, still haunts. Historians still argue whether it was right to make them do it, whether the weight of expectation crushed something tender inside them forever. And what of Camilla? She kept a low profile in those days, understanding that public sentiment was a tidal wave Diana had created, and it wasn't safe to stand too close. Charles, too, retreated into the background, his approval ratings plummeting. The monarchy itself seemed shaken, teetering under the weight of public outrage. The Queen, initially silent, eventually addressed the nation, a rare, poignant broadcast that acknowledged Diana's unique role as the people's princess. It was an admission that the crown, for all its ancient power, had been humbled by a woman who had never truly fit the mold. Diana's death wasn't just the end of a life, it was the end of an era. The fairy tale had long since soured, but her passing sealed it in tragedy, turning her into something more than a princess, an icon, a legend. A symbol of compassion and vulnerability in a world that often demands stoicism. And so, as the world wept and the flowers piled up and the candles burned down to stubs, a quiet question lingered in the air. If Diana had been allowed to live her life, truly live it, free from cameras, free from duty, free from the crushing weight of expectations, what kind of woman might she have become? That, perhaps, is the greatest heartbreak of all. Diana's story didn't end with the crash in Paris. It lived on in headlines, in hearts, in whispered conversations, and family dinners around the world. Her legacy wasn't just in the roses left at the gates of Kensington Palace or the millions who wept at her funeral. It was in the way she changed the very fabric of what it meant to be royal and what it meant to be human in the public eye. The royal family took note. After Diana's death, the monarchy shifted, slowly but surely. They began to show a little more emotion, to bend just slightly under the pressure of public expectation. The Queen, once the embodiment of stoic duty, started to smile a little more in public, to engage with the crowds, to soften the edges of an institution that had once seemed carved in marble. Historians still debate whether Diana's influence was the driving force behind this shift, or whether it was simply the world changing around them, but one thing is certain. Diana's fingerprints were all over the transformation. And Charles, his long road back to public acceptance was slow, awkward, and filled with stumbles. It took years, decades, really, before Camilla was fully accepted as part of his life. When they finally married in 2005, it was a small, low-key ceremony, far from the grand spectacle of his wedding to Diana. Camilla became the Duchess of Cornwall, a compromise title that allowed her to stand by Charles's side without the full weight of Diana's legacy pressing down on her. It wasn't until much later, 2022, in fact, that the Queen, in a Platinum Jubilee message, gave her blessing for Camilla to be known as Queen Consort when Charles became king. A subtle, careful nod to the reality that had existed in the shadows for so long. William and Harry grew into men shaped by their mother's love and their family's struggles. William, steady and dutiful, married Catherine Middleton in a wedding that echoed his parents in grandeur but felt lighter, warmer, more modern. He and Kate carefully crafted an image of a stable, loving family, perhaps the very thing Diana had always wanted for herself. Harry, the younger, more rebellious one, charted his own course, falling in love with Meghan Markle, stepping back from royal duties, and, in a twist that felt almost inevitable, publicly sharing his own story of pain, of feeling trapped, of longing for something different. Historians still debate whether Harry's departure was a continuation of Diana's legacy or a rejection of it, but the echoes are impossible to ignore. Diana's legacy lives on in her charities, in the causes she championed, and the countless people who still say her name with a mixture of warmth and sadness. She was, and still is, the people's princess, the woman who took the cold, glittering machinery of the monarchy and made it feel human, messy, real. She wasn't perfect, far from it. She was flawed, impulsive, emotional, sometimes manipulative, sometimes naive. But that's what made her so beloved. She was real in a world that often demanded a polished and feeling mask. And the lessons, they're still being unpacked. The royal family has learned slowly that emotional openness, vulnerability, and a connection with the people matter just as much as tradition and duty. The media has had to reckon with its own role in Diana's life and death, though the paparazzi still chase after the next big story with unsettling determination. And the public, well, they've never stopped asking the question, how do we balance admiration and intrusion? When does fascination cross into destruction? There's a quirky detail that says it all. In the years after Diana's death, people still left cards, flowers, and teddy bears at Kensington Palace on her birthday. Some of the teddy bears, sun-faded and rain-soaked, stayed for weeks. It was as if the world wasn't quite ready to let go, to say goodbye to the woman who had captivated them, not with a crown, but with a smile, a tear, and an unguarded heart. Diana's story is a reminder, one that whispers across decades, that even in a world of castles, crowns, and carefully scripted lives, a single person, with all their flaws and hopes and heartaches, can leave an impact that lingers long after they're gone. The story of Diana and Charles, of their love, their heartbreak, their very public unraveling, is not just a royal tale, it's a deeply human one. It's a story of choices and chances, of duty and desire, of the quiet ache of being seen yet unseen. It's about the weight of expectation, the longing for love, and the cracks that form when a life is lived in a gilded cage. As you drift into sleep, imagine Diana, standing by the sea, her hair catching the breeze, her eyes soft and searching. She's not a princess in this moment, not an icon or a headline, just a woman, barefoot on the sand, wondering if love will ever feel simple, ever feel real. And Charles, in his garden at Highgrove, the scent of roses in the air, a trowel in his hand, dirt under his nails, lost in thought, perhaps about duty, or regret, or a future that feels both heavy and hollow. The world moves on, the crowns are passed down, the photos fade, the palaces echo with new voices. But some stories linger, like the scent of a rose on a warm summer night, or the memory of a song that once made you smile. Diana's story is like that, haunting, beautiful, imperfect, and so very human. So let your eyes close now. Let your breath slow. Picture the gentle hush of a royal garden at twilight, the distant laughter of children, the quiet rustle of leaves. Feel the softness of your blanket, the weight of the day slipping away. And as the story fades into the night, know that some tales stay with us not because they're perfect, but because they remind us what it means to love, to lose, and to be a little bit brave. Sweet dreams.